This podcast is a quest for well-being, a quest for a meaningful life through the exploration of fundamental truth. Enlightening ideas, insights on physical, mental, and spiritual health. The inspiration is love. The aspiration is to awaken new ways of thinking that can lead us to a new way of being well. Welcome to Body, Mind, and Soul Healing Conversations.
It has practically become trendy for some people, particularly celebrities, to reveal their trials and tribulations of battling depression. It is almost as if you have not lived unless you can express that you know depression. People are starting to wear it like a badge of courage. Although this coming out has helped to destigmatize the illness, it also has had a spin-off effect on reducing the perceived seriousness of it. To the uninformed, watching Jim Carey reveal his bout with depression on 60 Minutes made it difficult to appreciate how debilitating it is. The seemingly apparent contradiction of a zany comedian who starred in the movie Dumb and Dumber and yet expressed his battles with depression did not add up. To add to the recent celebrity revelations, people often now use the word depression loosely and in a generic context to denote a temporary lapse of enjoyment, as in, I know how you feel, I have felt depressed myself. Depression and feeling depressed are not even in the same ballpark. The differentiation is critical. The seriousness and impact of the illness must not be lost in the zest for society to understand and accept the dis-ease. It is a delicate balance, indeed, writes Bruce. Valeria Teles interviews Bruce R. Ross, the author of Breaking Free of Depression's Grip, a Powerful Success Story. Bruce R. Ross has lived with depression and anxiety for his adult life, more than 45 years. Despite this disease 24/7, Bruce overcame its debilitating effects and has led a successful family life, career, and personal life. After 34 years working in the credit union sector, Bruce retired as a senior vice president, finance from a $1 billion financial institution. He is a lecturer at Fanshawe College, has a Bachelor of Commerce degree, Chartered Professional Accountant's CPA certification, is Certified Financial Planner CFP designation, and he has a Master's of Business Administration MBA degree. Bruce finished 5 marathons after the age of 35 and completed 3 triathlons, including a half Ironman after the age of 40. He traveled to all 50 U.S. states and all 10 Canadian provinces. Bruce was born and raised in Nova Scotia and moved to Ontario in 1987. He currently resides in Mayford with his wife Cheryl and daughter Hannah. Meet Bruce at brucerross.ca. Here's the interview with Bruce R. Ross.
In your own words, who is Bruce R. Ross?
Thanks for asking, Valeria. Bruce R. Ross, R is my middle name, Roderick, so that's where you get the R from. I'm 62 years old. I live in Canada. I was born and raised in Nova Scotia, which is the eastern province of Canada. But I moved to Ontario in 1987, and I live about 2 hours north of Toronto, so centrally located within Canada now. I've been married to my wife, Cheryl, a music teacher, retired music teacher. I've been married for 26 years. Worked in the financial sector in Canada and retired a couple years ago as the senior vice president of a fairly large credit union. But the reason I'm here today, frankly, is I'm a typical individual, frankly, who suffered or dealt with depression and anxiety as well for my entire adult life. So it's 45 years or more. And I've experienced most treatments that are available for depression sufferers, mostly to no avail, but it's been a lengthy journey. And as a result, I've written quite I believe, an inspiring book depression called Breaking Free of Depression's Grip, which I believe we'll talk about later, that chronicles my lifelong journey with depression and provides hope for those depression sufferers that not is all lost as a result of the disease. So that's in a compact version of who I am, and I'm ready for questions, Valeria.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bruce, again, for sharing the message, for being you, for being open to life. That's what I see. So my second official question is about joy or happiness. How would you describe what joy is or happiness?
Well, that's a tough question to ask, frankly, because that has escaped me for so long in life, really since grade 9, that I've experienced true joy. It's very difficult for me to quantify that because I've lacked it for so long, and that's what I've been on a journey to search for joy. But it certainly, to me, I can visualize it as appreciating and loving true love of my family and events of life and appreciating life for what it is and not dwelling on kind of the negatives, but appreciating the positives. That to me is joy. And unfortunately, that has escaped me. So it's very difficult for me to explain because I really don't typically feel it. And it's been a struggle for all these years. So it's very difficult to put into words.
You did mention positivity. So keeping ourselves positive or focused, kind of our attention in the positive things. Kind of what comes to me is gratitude, being grateful for what we have. That automatically makes me happy. So that kind of makes sense when you say that, when you connect happiness and joy to positivity.
Right.
And another question I have is about the purpose of the human experience. What do you think that is?
The purpose of the human experience is to do what's right for your fellow human being. I believe any situation that would apply to one of my greatest admired individuals is Martin Luther King Jr. And he had a quote, a saying of, "The time is always right to do what's right." And I believe I've aspired to reach that, to live by that quote, and treat my fellow human beings in that manner. To do what's right to others as you would expect. So that would kind of be my take on it.
Yeah, and I wonder why, Bruce, a lot of times, and I have asked the question here, why do we feel so strongly about helping others and doing the right thing, as you say?
I'm not sure why it is. I think it's innate human behavior, I believe. I mean, we're social animals by nature and have been for thousands of years. So I believe that you gain acceptance, and if you do support others and treat others kindly and with compassion, I believe it makes you feel part of the social group that we're innately conditioned to do. So I think that's really it. I think there's a bit of a scientific answer to that question.
That very much resonates
Right.
with me. I guess to add to that is that I wonder why some of us have kind of gotten away from that path. It's almost like going against our own nature. And instead of supporting and helping others, we have been seeing that in this earth, human beings doing the opposite, killing one another, starting wars and all that. So I wonder, how did that happen?
You know what, Valerie, I'm not sure really about that one, but I agree it does seem to be a tendency of recent years for that to have happened, for some of our societies to be fragmented. I know in Canada and the United States, they're both experiencing that now. In the political realm, it just does seem to be happening. I sometimes wonder if what it is, and a little more business approach to it, the answer is it's less land of opportunity for the Western world than it used to be, than it was, say, 50 years ago. The resources are a little tighter. People aren't growing economically as much as they used to be, and they're getting a little more protective, I believe, and I think they are looking inward instead of outward, unfortunately. and looking at serving themselves as best they can and kind of forgetting their fellow human being. I think that's what's happening, but that's just my conjecture.
Right. So it's the focus on the results and money making, and
Yes.
right? It feels very unnatural to me. But,
Yes.
and I do believe that we can survive, in a sense, and thrive in every way if we unite, if we help ourselves and others at the same time. That's how I feel. But not all of us feel this way.
Well, it's interesting. I know it's very troubling times what's happening in Ukraine right now, but if there's some irony, it has united most of the world for a common cause to support Ukrainians, and that's kind of interesting phenomena. Unfortunately, it does have feelings of World War II leading up to that, and that's very troubling. But if there is a positive, most of the world is really kind of gathering around a central goal, and that is peace and help the Ukrainians. So there is a bit of positive, but
the message is we can focus on the positive
right.
amidst anything, right, Bruce, in a way. We have this ability. It seems like it's an innate kind of ability we all have, which is amazing. With that in mind, do you have any spiritual ideas, insights, belief systems?
Well, I'm certainly, I believe in God, and I am a Christian for what it's worth. Probably not as much a practicing Christian as I should be, but I certainly believe in it. But I respect other individuals for what their belief system is, whether or not there is a God or not. That's fine with me too. I don't have a preference one or another as far as what other people do. I believe in that it's their right and their prerogative to believe in what they believe is right. And so that's really part of my belief system. Is I have some core values myself. In fact, I believe my own ethics and integrity, which really isn't a belief system as per se, but my own integrity and ethics got me through some of the tough times that we'll be talking about shortly. And that was a sense of comfort for me, and that I would do the right thing and be able to march on despite the tough times that I endured.
You wrote the book, Breaking Free of Depression's Grip, A Powerful Success Story. So my initial questions are, how did you become a writer? And what was the main inspiration, which we already have an idea, and intention of writing your book?
Well, it's interesting because the reason I started to write the book, I started over 10 years ago, was actually as a self-help measure. It was one of the many self-help measures I undertook to combat the illness, in addition to the professional measures that I undertook with the doctors and so forth in the medical profession. But I started writing it for therapeutic reasons, because I'd read that if you have ruminating and uneasy thoughts in your mind, that if you put them on paper, it helps to resolve take the pressure off what's going on in your head, so to speak, because you externalize them onto paper. So that's how I started as a therapeutic measure, and that's it just evolved from there. I chronicled my life and how I felt and how I didn't feel and so forth. And then what happened, the more I wrote, and particularly in the last couple of years with the onset of COVID, with the increase in mental health issues in our societies, that there could be a market for my journey to share with individuals who are experiencing much the same as I am. So that's how it started and how it evolved to where it is today.
Let me ask you another question, open question about your book. What was the most challenging chapter or passage in your book? The most challenging passage or chapter to write?
Good question. Surprisingly, I didn't have a lot of trouble writing most of the chapters. It flowed fairly easily, and which is surprising in particular because I'm a private person by nature. So to write it in, be very candid in my thoughts and feelings and experiences and put in for the public view, which is kind of surprising. But your question, the Most difficult, it wasn't a complete chapter, but it was a section of a chapter that was most difficult, I found, was to write about my family. Unfortunately, my family was not close. I called it emotional difference. I have two older brothers, and I had, of course, parents. And the five of us were living in the house, grew up in the house, but we weren't really a family unit. We were just five individuals living under the same roof. There wasn't a lot of love or affection shown in our household at all by any means. And I honestly believe that contributed to how I felt later on in life. But I felt it was very difficult to write about that subject because it was very personal. And also, I recognize that in our society, it's very taboo to speak negatively about parents. And so I had to be very careful of that, very cognizant of that. So I would say that was the most difficult part to talk about my family relationships and so forth. I think that was probably the most difficult component of the book. It wasn't a whole chapter, but it was certainly a component.
Thank you for sharing that, Bruce. I can relate to that, of course, because I wrote a book about my own story, and I hesitated a lot to kind of expose my parents and how unloving they were.
Exactly.
That was a tough one, but I did it anyway. You knew too. Good.
It might be kind of the elephant in the room that people really don't want to talk about parental relationships. It's just kind of a bit of a taboo topic, and I think we'd be better served if we did open up about it and at least talk about it candidly. But as I say, it seems to be a bit of the elephant. But I was aware of that as well. So I was pretty careful of what I wrote too.
I never had children, but you have children. You have a daughter, right? So how did that affect you? Did you try to be quite the opposite?
Well, I'm trying to break the chain for sure. And yes, I found I was kind of the extreme the other, or have been somewhat the extreme the other way. I've been very involved in Hannah, her name is. She's a third year university student in Ontario. I've tried to stay involved in her life, unlike my own parents, and tried to show her love and affection that she deserves. That will hopefully help her get a start in life and be on her own and be kind of safe and feel secure in the world. Just to give you an indication, Hannah's on the university synchronized skating team, and they had the provincial championships a couple of weeks ago, and I drove 3 hours just to watch her and the rest of her team perform for, I think it was 3 minutes. But I drove the 3 hours just for that, just to watch her skate for 3 minutes. That was just my commitment to her, that because there was nobody else there to watch her, from family, that is. But I made sure I made it. So that was just kind of the extreme measure I undertook, which my parents didn't with me. So
she wants to become a psychologist, I believe.
Yes, that's correct. She's in the psychology program now. It's called Psychology with the Concentration in Neuroscience and Behavior. And that's her intent, is to go into the mental health field, as you say, psychologist. And that I didn't try to influence her to do that by any means, but I'm certainly happy she has chosen to go that route. And I'm certainly sure that I have been an influence on her to better people's lives, and that's why she's chosen it. She's seen what I've gone through, although I tried to insulate her from my pain, but still she saw it anyway, and has made up her mind that she's going to go on a bit of a mission to help other people in the future. So power to her. I very much support her.
So moving to the topic of depression and anxiety. In the book, you say, I think it was the description of the book, it says that you endured depression and its twin, generalized anxiety disorder. I never thought about depression and anxiety as being connected, but they are. Right, Bruce?
Typically, you see both together, not all the time, but you do. And in fact, in my case, I've never had a doctor tell me this, but in fact, the investigative background as to the causes of the depression have been minimal. But I think that what I know now is I think anxiety has been as much a contributor to my mental health issues as the depression. I think it was almost, maybe instead of being 90% depression, 10% anxiety, I think it was probably more 60% depression, 40 anxiety. So I think anxiety actually played a much greater role than I thought earlier on in my life. But they are quite often go hand in hand. So that's why I refer to them as a twin sister.
There's a topic in your book that really caught my attention when it comes. I interview a lot of people here on mental health, emotional health, all kinds of health, but especially emotional health and mental health and also spiritual health. So caught my attention when you said that there's a difference between the depression, the disorder, and feeling depressed. So I would love to hear more about that, Bruce.
Well, I think what's happened in recent years, it's been positive and it's been negative. There are a lot of celebrities that have come out of the woodwork in recent times with interviews and television appearances and so forth to express that they've had depression. And it's almost overkill in the sense everybody's talking about it. And it kind of reduces the effectiveness or not the effectiveness, but the seriousness of the disease of depression. It's almost as if you haven't lived life unless you had depression. So if somebody's, for lack of a better term, is bummed out for a little bit, they're deemed to have depression and know what know it's all about. And I kind of beg to differ. I think depression is a little deeper, a little more intensive, a little more chronic in most cases than simply having the blues. I think not to take away from the feeling depressed, but I don't think it's the same as having depression. I think depression is much deeper, deep-seated, deep-rooted than simply having the depressive type of feelings, which are more temporary and more little not lighter, but certainly not as intense.
So how would you describe that? Because I know in your case, it was depression, the disorder, and not just feeling depressed. What are the signs actually for the listeners? That would be great for them to know and what to watch for in a way.
Well, there's certainly a couple, you don't separate into two components. One is the mental component and the second one is the physical component. But the mental component for major depressive orders, just like cancer, there's a number of different types of cancers, obviously. So depression's the same way. But when people talk about depression, they typically are referring to major depressive disorder or clinical depression or severe depression or just a generic term, depression. So that's what I've had and dealt with for so many years. But some of the symptoms, the two most noteworthy is you've just lost interest in doing anything, to getting out of bed type of thing, to going out for social activities. And there's just an overall depressed mood. So just a, kind of cloud over your head kind of thing. And there's, deeper thoughts like suicidal thoughts is quite prevalent because you feel as if you'd be better off if you weren't alive, so that's obviously very serious. And hopelessness, quite often you feel very hopeless. And also one interesting thing, it's not really a symptom, but it's a result of it, is that you feel very alone. Now, there's something like the 280 million people worldwide have depression, but when you have depression, you feel like you're the only one. And so it's a very lonely experience. So those are some of the mental kind of aspects, but the physical aspects, there are some physical components too, such as fatigue, loss of appetite, just problems sleeping, maybe psychomotor agitation, so fidgeting or rubbing your hands, that type of thing. So some physical issues that resonate with depression, but the mental ones are mostly the concerns. And another one would be poor concentration. It's very difficult to concentrate when you're depressed. It's very, you just don't want to concentrate. Even reading a book can be a challenge. You just want to really, for lack of a better term, veg out, so to speak. Those are some of the symptoms and characteristics.
And this is actually I can resonate with some of them because I experienced feeling depressed. And now I'm wondering if I actually was depressed, the disorder was depression. Does it have a cure? Like now, are you completely cured and healed from depression?
No, in fact, I probably will never be. But having said that, I've been, for just to recap or to put in perspective, I had depression for about 45 years, a little more than that. But the first 20 were undiagnosed. I just struggled along with something I didn't know what was wrong with me. And it wasn't until about 25 years ago that it was finally diagnosed. That's kind of the timelines. During that time, I tried over 20 different medications. So many I've lost count, some of them in by themselves, some of them augmenting other medications, but they were really ineffective. I've been a lot of other treatments, therapy, obviously, the dreaded electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, and I grew up in the era that, mental health issues were, from what you read or saw on One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Jack Nicholson, that famous.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so ECT was in that movie. And so but anyway, I tried that, didn't work, and many other treatments. Having said all that, in the last year, my doctor did try a fairly new medication. It's not actually an antidepressant. It's actually a antipsychotic drug that is used for other purposes, including depression, and that is called Rexulti, is I guess the brand name. So to get to answer your question, to get around to that, you mentioned about a cure. It's not a cure, but it certainly has resolved or relieved some of the depressive symptoms, this Rexulti medication. And so I'm sticking with that. There are some side effects. I have nausea and lightheadedness, but I've kind of made the trade-off. I have a balance into that. I will take the mental health improvement at the expense of physical health challenges, and in my mind, that tells me that the mental health pain, the relief from that, is more important than from physical health pain. So that's probably as much as the cure as I'm going to get, Valeria, is thanks to the Rexulti.
I want to go back to the prior discovering that you suffer from depression. You have accomplished a lot, Bruce, in your life. You have done a lot. So how is it possible to suffer from depression as you did and still do everything that you have done?
Well, that's a good question, Valeria. That's certainly a contradiction. There's no question. It's interesting. One of the characteristics of depression or symptoms is typically that you have lost hope in the future. In my case, I didn't lose hope, and I don't know why. I just didn't. I always believed that if I accomplished another goal, that I would, my ship would come in, so to speak, and I would find some contentment and peace in my life. So that's what drove me to accomplish a lot of the goals you speak of. I have a pretty strong post-academic education. I've traveled. I had a lot of interest in traveling to the United States and Canada. I've been to all 50 of the United States. And I took exercise to the extreme.
Yeah, you did.
Because I had read that if you exercise, that'll relieve some of the depression. So I started when I was 38 years old. I picked up running for the first time. And 5 months later, I ran the Pittsburgh Marathon. Then after that, I ran the New York City Marathon and the Chicago Marathon, and then the Park City, Utah Marathon, and then Detroit Marathon. So I've run 5 marathons, and that was a self-help measure to make me feel better, to get me to feel better. It wasn't particularly effective, but it was one more goal that I accomplished. But what I found was that the finish line kept on moving back, so to speak. I'd accomplished one goal, and I still wasn't satisfied, so I looked for another goal. So when the marathon didn't do it, then I escalated to triathloning when I was in my 40s. In fact, when I was almost 42 years old, I ran a half Ironman triathlon. And for the listeners, that entails a 2-kilometer swim, a 90-kilometer bike ride, and a half marathon run. It took me over 6 hours, but I did it. But that wasn't the solution for the depression, so I kept on moving forward for that and accomplishing several other goals. I'm a lecturer at a college in Ontario here. I do that part-time and as well. So other things like that. But they were goals that I kept on looking for, to help me feel better. And then a number of years ago, I also obtained my MBA when I was 55 years old. That's right. That's not. So all attempts to help me feel better, and they were self-help attempts. So it's a contradiction to say you had depression and you were still able to accomplish that. That's true, but there's a kind of rationale for taking on these projects. Unfortunately, they weren't particularly effective, and after a while, a couple years ago, I kind of gave up and said, doesn't matter what I do, I'm just not going to find peace and contentment. So I kind of accepted that.
Listening to you kind of resonates again with my own story of feeling so bad emotionally that I was trying everything to feel better physically, all these accomplishments, and nothing made me feel better. And then I kind of wondered if, when I started writing the book, if that had to do with my self-esteem.
Yes.
Because I had very low self-esteem. I had no love. And I was trying to kind of inflate my self-esteem to make me feel like I was worth something and kind of adding value by adding all these things from the outside. And it never really happened.
Never.
And then for me, it was really a shift in perspective in the sense of spirituality. I mean, some call it spirituality, which to me, it's almost like it's the truth now with capital T, that we are all unconditionally loved by life itself, not by God, any entity, but life is utterly supportive of itself, like plants and flowers. You see, they're all like, wow, they're flourishing. That's the message it's trying to tell us all the time. That's okay to feel sad. It's just try to look deeper into the nature of life, which is incredibly beautiful.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
I don't know how that happened, and then it shifted the mind. There was a shift in perspective or perception. And then I became very joyful and happy almost every day. And I'm like, I have no idea how that happened either, but it just happened.
I can tell you that hasn't quite happened to me yet. I realize that from a rational and logical perspective, I need to do that, but to appreciate and love and so forth. But it's been very difficult to make that transition. I'm very fortunate with my wife, Cheryl, and my daughter to have a loving relationship with them. But it's somewhat one way that's more there to me than me to them. I just have trouble showing affection, and that's very disappointing to me, and I try to overcome that, but it's a challenge. I haven't quite made that transition yet, but I'm still working on it.
In the book, towards the end, you do mention some factors that are contributors to depression, and you actually say that's actually a combination of them. So you mentioned genetics, environmental, psychological, chemistry, hearing loss. It surprised me, as I said, off record. And then learning disability and analytical. So talk to me for a moment about these factors, if you could.
Sure. Well, I think the first ones you mentioned, Valeria, are pretty recognized ones, the chemistry, the genetics, and so forth. I think those apply to me. I've never really had a doctor spend a lot of time investigating the source of the depression and anxiety, but that's from my own research, really. But I think the chemistry, because it's been traced back to early high school, which is when the chemical changes take place in your body with puberty and that type of thing. So I think chemistry has a lot to do with it. The environment, I kind of mentioned earlier, it's kind of the taboo topic, but I think my negative lack of loving family certainly contributed to my alienated type of feelings that I have to this day. So I think that was a contributor. Genetics, certainly, that is something the medical profession does believe that has a pretty strong role in depression. I look at my father and my two brothers, and they were never diagnosed with depression because they never went to the doctor, but they would be diagnosed right away if they were. So The hearing one is an interesting one. I've never had a doctor suggest that, but I have a moderate hearing loss in both ears. I wear hearing aids, and I have for years. Before I had them, it was very difficult to you always felt alienated because you couldn't hear people, especially in the crowd. And so you kind of zone out from the conversations and feel more alone in the crowd than under normal circumstances with the depression. So I think the hearing loss certainly had a bit of a contributing factor to it. I forget some of the other ones that you mentioned, but those are the key ones that I relate to, certainly.
That's what we need to hear, the ones that you relate to the most, right? That comes to mind. That makes so much sense. The hearing loss, that makes sense to me too, because actually a huge part of communication is listening, is deep listening.
Yes.
It's not just talking. So that makes sense. That would affect the brain. You say the pain of depression tends to subside somewhat as a person ages. So with time, you're saying that it tends to become better.
Yeah, I think probably what I'm referring to there is when you get older, some of the peer pressure that was prominent when you were younger for social events and so forth, and to put on a show, let's face it, when you have that peer pressure when you're younger, those as you age and become much more settled in your life, then those aren't real factors. So you really aren't under the pressure to perform, I guess, as for others as you were earlier in life. So that's why I think the aging process has certainly helped. It relieves the depression. I think it's lessened somewhat. I'm not sure if some seniors would agree with that statement, because loneliness is so prevalent with a lot of seniors, and that's one of the characteristics of depression. And I know a lot of seniors deal with the loneliness. But for me, I'm a bit of a loner, so it hasn't bothered me to not be as part of much of a social scene as it used to be, the pressure for that.
And then the second positive aspect, if there is one, is that you mentioned earlier about escape-motivated accomplishments. And
Yes.
you actually said that, I wonder if depression drove me to achieve as much as I did in a self-help attempt to overcome it. So you talked about this earlier. That might be connected, and it was certainly my case.
Yes.
And then the three, you say that the understanding of depression, it has grown these days. So
Yes.
it's more open, right, to talk about mental health. Oh, would you like to add something, Bruce?
Go ahead. No, there's certainly a number of people, as we talked about earlier, that have come out of it and promoted the significance of depression, how real it is. I mean, Oprah Winfrey is somebody who's come out, Ellen DeGeneres, Brad Pitt. I mean, what guy wouldn't want to look like Brad Pitt? And, how can he have had depression? We talked about Ukraine a little while ago briefly, and, timely to mention Winston Churchill. He called his black dog. He had depression. Abe Lincoln, one of the most respected presidents in the United States, he suffered from depression all the time, ongoing. So, I mean, it just those are historical figures, but they're becoming more prominent now. Rob Williams is kind of a sad testament to depression, but he talked about it a little bit, and Princess Diana, on to go. So, anyway, it's coming more exposed. It's and more accepted.
At the end of the book, you talk about recommendations from your experience. So
Right.
You mentioned some of them. Accept it, it's one, and then learn. And then you mentioned tabloid magazine solutions are not.
Right.
Share with important people.
Yes.
Keep up the fight, and you're not alone. A question that I have before we end the conversation today is about psychedelics or psilocybin mushrooms. There are actually lots of research today that shows the effectiveness of psychedelics. So I'm wondering if you tried, I think you didn't mention that in the book, but have you thought about psychedelics for depression?
I've certainly opened any objective, medically proven process to combat the depression. I haven't tried the psychedelic one. Those are fairly recent phenomena. Having said that, the one drug I have tried is ketamine.
Oh yeah, right. You
Ketamine
did.
was it was a hippie drug of choice in the 60s, and I believe recently it's been abused as a rape date drug, but under medically supervised conditions, it's been proven to be effective for major depression. In fact, it was on the cover of Time magazine a couple of years ago as the most promising breakthrough in depression since Prozac. But so I tried that. It was administered by IV, but frankly, but I didn't find it effective, so I moved on, and I haven't moved on to the psychedelic ones yet. Those are still fairly new.
I love that you tried so many different, you're open to try different methods and treatments.
Yeah.
That's really, really wonderful. Thank you for that, Bruce, because then you become this statement of life itself trying to support itself and to flourish. It's a beautiful message. So we're almost at the end. I do have a few more questions for you. Would you like to add anything else or read a passage in your book?
I don't have a passage as per se, but I'll just briefly recap the book. It chronicles my journey of 45 plus years of depression and anxiety, details some of the professional and self-help measures, some of them that we talked about today, and also talks about what I learned, what I didn't learn, how I opened up to friends, some of the interpersonal issues I dealt with as a result of the depression. But in the end, it's a book. It's written not by a PhD or MD, but an average North American who's lived it for so long. And it shares what it's truly like to live with depression. There's no preaching morals or cures in the book, but it is one of hope. And the hope is that you can achieve it greatly in life despite the burden of depression and other mental illnesses for 24/7. That's really the message. And it's a positive message, it's an underlying message. It doesn't bonk you on the head, so to speak. That's really what the message is.
Yeah. Beautifully said, Bruce. I love everything about you. It's just so natural, so honest. Thank you so much for being you again. And before we say goodbye, let me ask you two questions. How do you define success these days?
I think that you define success as finding inner peace. I firmly believe that. It's unfortunately it's escaped me. I have felt tinges of it, but I think that's the success. You have friends and family, a loving family. I think that's success, and you appreciate what you have instead of not what you don't have. I think that's how you define success. It's not monetary. It's not material goods. It's emotional goods is my thought.
And my last question is, what 3 experiences you wish everyone to have before they lose the body, before they die?
Oh, that's a good, tough one. That's a tough one way down, Valeria. I think one is to find love. I think that's number one. That's key. I didn't have that growing up, and I realize now how I missed out on that. So I wish that on anybody, including myself. I think number one. I think 2, be satisfied with who you are. Don't try to achieve what others have achieved. Do what you want to do, what you feel good about doing. And the third thing is, that's a tough one. I think there's so many of them, but I think it's to help others as much as you can, as you're in a position to do. And by helping others, you'll help yourself. So I think it's a win-win situation.
So true. Yes, 1 trillion times to that. Those truths, Bruce. Thank you so much for sharing them.
Thank you, Valeria.
And before we say goodbye, where can we find more information about you, your books, products, services, and future projects?
Great. Thank you for asking. So I have a website. It's brucerross.ca. So notice there's an R in the middle there. So brucerross.ca. You can you can get my book through that website. It's also available on Amazon.com and Amazon.ca, which is the Canadian version of the Amazon. Those are the 3 main sources. And I'm not sure, it's called Breaking Free of Depression's Grip. And the breaking free, the title, sometimes what people ask me is why the title. It's not breaking free as in the traditional sense that there's a dramatic shift, but it's breaking free from a process really of breaking free of the mental health issues, and also breaking free of the stigma of the depression that has brought on. So it's just breaking free of that, being free from that stigma. That's the key of it, and that's really my book. And if you want to learn about depression, what it's truly like, it's a book for you. I truly believe that. I've had great comments from people who read it, and just have to get the message out.
Yes, wonderful. I'll have the link, the Amazon link, and your website link on your podcast profile too.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much again, Bruce, for your presence.
Valeria, thank you very much for having me on your program. Awesome.
Thank you. We'll talk soon. Bye for now, Bruce.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. To learn more about Bruce R. Ross and his work, please visit brucerross.ca.
To learn more about this podcast, please visit fitforjoy.org/podcast. Thank you again for listening, and bye for now.